Thank you. Please stand by. You will now be placed into conference.
Hello, welcome to the California Fire Science Consortium here in March 2014. My name is Susie Coper. I'm an extension forester for the University of California Cooperative Extension in the Central Sierra, and I am webcasting this webinar on behalf of the California Fire Science Consortium. So welcome. I just want to take a few minutes to orient you to the webinar. You'll see in the lower left-hand box corner of your screen a chat box. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat box so we know who's on the line. And if you have any technical questions or issues, go ahead and contact me that way. You should be hearing us broadcast through your speakers. We don't have an additional call-in line for you, but we will try to maximize our interaction with you through the chat box, so ask your questions there. As far as volume goes, we do sometimes have issues. The music is always louder than the voices when the voices come on. So what I suggest you do is look at the top of your box. There's a speaker button, and you have the ability to maximize the volume of your speakers right there on that button, as well as through your own computer controls. And if all else fails, I suggest you could try headphones. Sometimes people have trouble with us cutting in and out, but that is not on our end. That is usually the speed of your internet connection. So if it gets to that point because your connection is that slow, what you could do instead, potentially, is when we're done, you can listen to the recording on our Fire Science Consortium website. The recording never has any cutouts as it's recording the true sound. So let's see. People are introducing themselves. Thank you very much. We also had the entry poll. I hope that you all have taken the poll. It's just to give us a brief snapshot of where people are logging on from. It looks like we actually have the highest percentage from the San Francisco Bay Area and then from the Sierra Nevada. We have more than a majority of people online from the U.S. Forest Service, but we also have serious participation from NGOs and research and a few others, so welcome. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact me through the chat box as we go forward. Okay, so with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and proceed and bring up the presentation and introduce our first speaker. After Rodney speaks, we'll also have another speaker, Morgan Tingley, and then we will have potential for question and answer. And at the end, we also have an evaluation, an evaluation survey we hope that you will take. So we hope we plan this webinar to last for about an hour. If we have additional time, questions, we could also last a little bit longer if that's okay with our speakers. Otherwise, if you have additional questions that don't get asked, we can always try and follow up later by sending emails to those folks. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rodney Siegel. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Bird Populations, where he's been conducting research on avian ecology and conservation in California for over 15 years. He has published nearly 30 peer-reviewed scientific papers and produced dozens of technical reports and conservation strategies for federal and state agencies. He's been leading research and monitoring efforts pertaining to black-backed woodpecker in California since 2008. So Rodney, are you there?
I am.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Susie, and I want to start by just thanking everybody who logged on today to listen. I want to start by giving just a little bit of background and context about what we're doing today and why we're doing it, how we got here. The work that Morgan and I are going to be presenting today really grew out of a couple of Forest Service workshops on post-fire forest management at the Rim Fire, where a couple of us who were there had some concerns that the initial planning efforts we were seeing didn't appear to us to be retaining adequate habitat for black-backed woodpecker, and also that some of the stands that had been identified as retention stands didn't necessarily appear to be chosen using what we thought was the best information available on black-backed woodpecker habitat relationships. So we grumbled a little bit, and some Forest Service personnel graciously invited us to pretty much walk the talk, to collaborate with one another to produce our own habitat suitability map for black-backed woodpeckers on the rimfire, and to come up with some recommendations for how much habitat and which habitat we thought ought to be retained on the landscape for black-backed woodpeckers. So with that, we took that challenge and we formed an ad hoc work group that was open to anyone who wanted to participate, and all of the individuals and institutions on the first slide here were the participants in the work group. The primary data analyst on the work was Dr. Morgan Tingley, who's going to be co-presenting with me. Morgan was a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Institute for Bird Populations for about a year, and is currently doing a postdoc at Princeton University, and soon to be transitioning to a faculty position at University of Connecticut. So I'll be passing over the reins to Morgan in a little while when we start talking about the specific analytical techniques that we used in this modeling effort. And now I got to remember where the button is to get to the next slide. Here we go. I'm sorry. So my intention today is not to talk a whole lot about basic black-backed woodpecker biology, but there are just a few salient points I want to hit to make sure we're all on the same page first. The first of these is that black-backed woodpeckers in California are strongly associated with recently burned conifer forest, which they typically colonize within about a year after forest fire. And the draw there is their primary food source, the larvae of wood-boring beetles that attack fire-killed trees in large numbers. It's a pretty ephemeral habitat association. During the decade after fire, as the fire-killed trees dry out and fall, the prey population for the woodpeckers declines, generally rapidly between year 5 and year 10, and the black-backed woodpeckers pretty much abandon the areas during that time period. The other point to make is that burn forests are, of course, also commonly treated with salvage logging or other post-fire management that involves the removing of fire-killed trees. And we know that to the extent that fire-killed snags are removed, the habitat becomes less suitable for black-backed woodpeckers. To the point, if all of the dead trees are removed, it's no longer black-backed woodpecker habitat at all. So that sets up a potential conflict, or at least a need to balance objectives between post-fire salvage logging and retention of habitat for black-backed woodpeckers. So that's all the background information I'm going to provide today on black-backed woodpecker ecology, and I want to instead focus this introductory section on describing the data sources that we used for the model that Morgan is going to be presenting. I think this is important partly because I just believe that the quality of the data are key to the quality of the outputs of the models, and I want to explain where the data come from. And I also really honestly want to give props to the regional office for having the foresight to conceptualize and fund data collection efforts, monitoring and research efforts that, in this case, I believe are yielding really good management relevant information in a timely way right when that information is needed. So I think it's kind of a success story for monitoring efforts here that we're able to provide this information right at this time. So there are two related studies from which we harvested data for the models. The first one is black-backed woodpecker management indicator species, or MIS monitoring. Black-backed woodpeckers are a designated management indicator species for burn forests across the 10 forests of the SNEP planning area in California. And management indicator species monitoring of black-backed woodpeckers has been implemented as a partnership between the Institute for Bird Populations and the region. We initiated it with a pilot study in 2008 and then fully implemented in 2009, and the work is ongoing. And at its crux, it involves surveys during each breeding season. We visit approximately 20 recent fire areas. Those are areas that burned between 1 and 10 years ago, up and down the 10 forest area, and we hit each one of those fire areas with a transect of 20 broadcast surveys for black-backed woodpeckers. And the image there is just one of our staff members holding up a digital wildlife collar and conducting a broadcast survey. And this is just an image from our website, from our project website, which provides an interactive map for users to explore some of the detection information from the surveys up and down the whole study area there. So you can get a sense just from the image of the breadth of the study area. Those are all survey points in different fires up and down the 10 forest area. And in fact, since 2008, we've conducted surveys in 94 fires up and down that area. And then our basic analytical approach has been to use hierarchical Bayesian occupancy modeling, which Morgan is going to describe in a lot more detail later, to estimate detection probability and occupancy probability of black-backed woodpeckers in burned areas as functions of both environmental and survey variables. And I'm not going to go into detail here. I just wanted to make the point that we have successfully published our work based on these field methods and our overall analytical approach. And there's just an image there from a paper we published a couple years back in Ecosphere on this work. And then the second study from which we're harvesting data for this effort is a more intensive study where we looked at home range characteristics and foraging habitat selection at 3 selected fires. And those were the Peterson Fire, the Sugarloaf Fire, and the Wheeler Fire, which is also sometimes called the Antelope Complex Fire on the Lassen and Plumas National Forests. And for this work, we captured focal individual black-backed woodpeckers, and we attached radio transmitters to their tails, and then we radio tracked the birds throughout a couple of breeding seasons, studying their movements and their habitat selection. This just gives you an idea of what the raw data from that study looked like. Each of the points is an individual foraging observation of a black-backed woodpecker, and the different colors represent unique birds that we radio tracked. And then we used kernel-based statistics from those foraging observations to estimate the actual home range of 15 black-backed woodpeckers that all had sufficient data for this effort. And we also collected on-the-ground and remote-sensed habitat data across the range of each black-backed woodpecker. I'm not going to provide a lot of detail about our results, but I just want to point out one important result that feeds directly into our models. And that was that among the 15 birds that we radio tracked, we discovered a really large variation in home range size. Home ranges varied by over an order of magnitude, and the majority of that variation in home range size could be explained by just a single relatively simple habitat variable, which was average snag basal area across the home range. And so Morgan will be showing you how we integrated that result into our model. So with all these data, our purpose was to come up with a habitat suitability model that could serve really as a decision support tool to inform selection of retention stands for black-backed woodpecker habitat based upon the best available scientific information. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to present our analytical approach. And then Morgan, do you need me to advance the slides, or are you able to do that?
I can do it on my own.
Okay, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Rodney, and thank you all for coming and listening to this. I'm going to have it get a little bit more methodological here. Rodney gave some good background, but I want to talk about how we actually did this modeling. And our goal was to try and get a spatial map of expected density of black-backed woodpecker pairs at the Forest Service portion of the rim fire. And we took this, the approach that we took was to essentially model 2 different surface layers and then multiply them together to get expected density. And so the first was this idea of it was a landscape level occupancy probability, and we multiplied that by a density map if you assume full occupancy. And the 2 together essentially result in expected density. I'm going to explain a little bit what this approach is because it represents something that's not typically done in terms of people trying to model abundance and model density. So I want you to, when you're thinking about modeling density, I want you to think about a heterogeneous landscape like a burn forest, where the sort of the habitat differs in terms of the resources that are available to a specific species. In the case of black-backed woodpeckers, you can imagine this map here, this modeled map, represents variances in snag basal area. So you have areas with low snag basal area and areas with high snag basal area. And then this is a patchy landscape. What you'd assume then, or what we found with black-backed woodpeckers and is common for many species, is that home range size varies with some sort of linear relationship to this resource availability. So in areas where you have high resource availability, like those dark gray squares, you'd expect to have small home range sizes. In areas where the resources are not as good, the species, the individual has to spread out more and has larger home ranges. So we take ourselves from our sort of our resource map to a map of home ranges. But this idea, this could essentially give you an idea of what sort of full density or full abundance on a landscape might look like, but that's not actually what landscapes look like in reality. In reality, you don't have sort of complete filling of home ranges, but you often have some sort of patchiness of home ranges. So to get there, you have to combine this with something else. And that something else is just a blanket map of sort of landscape level probability of occupancy, which is going to be determined by a lot of other factors. You take this landscape level occupancy probability that's determined by sort of broad scale factors and multiply it by the density if occupied to get your expected density. And so you can imagine like putting that occupancy surface on as sort of a probability times the home range map. And so, for instance, if you just sort of randomly selected that, you might get this patchwork of 6 different home ranges. But what we're really interested in is not trying to say that, predict exactly where any single home range may or may not be, because that's a probabilistic occurrence, but really look actually at the underlying values and say that in these areas on the left, where you have low occupancy but also low resource density, this is where you'd expect to have the lowest expected density of the species. And on the right, where you'd have the high occupancy probability but also high resource density, is where you expect to have the highest expected density of the species. And so this combined occupancy and density is what we are calling expected density, and it's what we're trying to model. So this is essentially the framework that we took to get to from these 2 different values to expected density that we can model across the landscape. I'm going to talk now about how we actually did this with our data. So Rodney gave some background into our occupancy modeling framework and how we use the MIS data to do this. And so I'll give a small little background to occupancy. It's a modeling framework that really started to be developed in the mid-2000s and is now widely used across sort of the wildlife monitoring world. And it tries to bridge between what are true occurrences, which is essentially what we really want to know, and observed occurrences, which is what actually happens when we go out to the field and look for animals. And the difference between the two happens to be because we can go out and look for animals, and we may not see them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not there, because our ability to detect animals is not perfect. So we have true occurrences and observed occurrences. In between the two, to translate between the two, we build a hierarchical model. And so the top level of that hierarchy is, in this case, we model the probability that a fire is occupied by at least one black-backed woodpecker. And then since we did our surveys at different points, we said then if you have a fire that's occupied, what is the probability that a point within that fire is occupied by at least one black-backed woodpecker? And then what is the probability if you have a point that has a woodpecker, what's the probability of actually detecting it on a single survey? So that's the structure of the hierarchical model we built. And then we put in different covariates as a relationship to each of one of these levels of the hierarchy. So the fire identity and, more importantly, the age of the fire impacts whether or not the fire itself is likely to be occupied by woodpeckers. The points within fires were model is a function of elevation, latitude, fire severity, pre-fire canopy cover, tree size, and the WHR forest type. And then the probability of detection was modeled as a function of our survey type, whether or not we were doing passive surveys or these broadcast surveys, and survey length, which is the amount of time we actually were waiting to detect woodpeckers. So we put this all into a Bayesian hierarchical model and run it. We did it, in this case, I fit the data using 1,574 broadcast surveys that were taken over 4 years from 2009, 2012. That came from 87 different fires on Forest Service land in California. Just some examples of what the output of that data looks like. There's a strong effect for fire age, so your probability of having fire occupied by black-backed woodpeckers declines greatly starting around 5 to 7 years post-fire. Elevation is a very, very strong effect. And in this case, we're controlling for the effect of latitude, so your x-axis is kind of hard to read without knowing exactly what elevation you're talking about. But essentially, you start to really get a lot more woodpeckers above around 5,000 feet or 4,500 feet. We also found that the occupancy of woodpeckers increased with increasing pre-fire canopy cover and also with fire severity. These are the same relationships that were published in that ecosphere paper that came out in 2010, 2011? 2011. So we took these relationships and we applied them to the data we had for the rimfire. And the nice thing about the model that we built is that it has essentially, it's built on all these remotely sensed landscape factors that are all data that we have already for the rimfire. And that we have for most fires that occur essentially right after they happen. And so what you're seeing in this map is the probability of the black-backed woodpecker occupancy per each one of these cells. And anywhere you see color is an area where we are expecting that woodpeckers could occur, so the probability of occupancy is greater than 0. But you'll see that in the upper right quadrant, the sort of the northern quadrant, is where you actually have much higher probabilities of occupancy, and that's because of the effect of elevation. Because our model has a very strong effect of elevation, that area is just expected to have higher probabilities of occupancy. So that's the first half of the modeling approach. And the second half then is trying to get our density map, our home range density expectation map. So this goes back to our telemetry work, which Rodney gave the introduction to. And so we have this very, very strong relationship between home range size and mean snag basal area. And that's sort of quantified by that basic equation on the right. Now, what you can do then is if we have a map of snag basal area for the rimfire, we can just simply apply that equation on the right to get the expected home range size per cell. You take the inverse of that, and you get the expected density per cell. The problem is that we actually don't have mean snag basal area data yet for the rimfire, particularly since we started doing this modeling in December, and we probably will get that data from LIDAR eventually, and certainly after survey crews start to go in there relatively soon, we'll have on-the-ground data. But we have to essentially try and remotely sense it for the time being. So the way we did this was we actually went back to our telemetry data where we collected in the background, we collected 3,237 sample points of habitat within the 3 fires we sampled as part of the telemetry work. And each one of those sample points, we measured the snag basal area, but then we also had these remotely sensed variables of pre-fire canopy cover, burn severity, and WHR stand size class. I put them into a model, including 2A interactions, and was able to predict essentially the post-fire basal area from those factors. And you can see that plot on the left shows the relationship between predicted post-fire basal area, with red being higher basal area and blue being lower basal area, with pre-fire canopy cover and burn severity, which are the 2 biggest explanatory factors. And not unsurprisingly, if you have higher pre-fire canopy cover, you have more trees before the fire, and if the fire burns more severely, you're going to end up with more basal area of snags. So that's not a particularly surprising relationship, but it's one that we wanted to be able to model. We wanted to be able to model it so we could then predict snag basal area into the rimfire, which is that plot on the right. So that plot on the right is the rimfire now with your predictions of mean basal area of snags. I was able to then take that and apply that equation from our telemetry work to get the predicted black-backed woodpecker density given occupancy. So this map is now colored in terms of pairs per 100 hectares. And the 100 hectare block is shown up there in the upper right. So giving you an idea of what 100 hectares looks like. And so each pixel then gives you the color of how many pairs would be expected if you have a block that size and that color of each of the pixels. Now, but this map is scaled to pairs per 100 hectare, but we can actually scale it down to the level of pairs per pixel, which is going to be a fraction, that each pixel is much smaller than a single home range. But that allows us to actually do something. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So once we know that we have our expected snag basal area, our expected density of black-backed woodpeckers given occupancy, all we need to do is multiply it by occupancy, and that gives us predicted black-backed woodpecker density accounting for this variable occupancy probability. So again, this is scaled to pairs per 100 hectares, but if you scale it, if you reduce it down to pairs per pixel, you can actually then use this and add up all those pixels that you see to get an actual estimation of the total population within a specific area. So for instance, if you actually add up all those density values per pixel for every colored pixel in this map, you get a total value of 42 expected pairs of black-backed woodpeckers within the Forest Service region of the rimfire.
Hey, Morgan, could I jump in for just one moment? I got a question offline from one of the participants that I would like to just address in case other people have the same question, which is what are the grayed out areas? And I just wanted to explain that the grayed out area on the far east there is Yosemite National Park, and all of the other gray polygons are private inclusions within the forest. Sorry for interrupting.
No worries. I also, I'll just take a quick second. Trish Johnson asked a question. Was the stand size and basal area plotted on pre-fire vegetation data like eVeg, or was it plotted after the fire? So the basal area that we took from our telemetry data, we collected ourselves in the field. The basal area that we're using here in this study, Susie, if you can move the question, thanks. The basal area that we're using here in this study is based just on this remotely sensed data relationship. So we're not using basal area yet from the rimfire because we do not have that available yet. We're not looking for basal area of all trees, we're looking for basal area of snags, if that wasn't entirely clear. And so we can only measure basal area of snags after the fires. So our predictions are that we have 42 black-backed woodpecker pairs across this area of Forest Service land in the rimfire, which is to be the colored area. And then sort of one final step was that when we were trying to come up with these estimates of actual black-backed woodpecker populations, we wanted to also account for the effects of fragmentation or habitat that's discontinuous. So if you look at this map, you can see certainly areas like here where you have lots of continuous habitat of various quality, but then you have little pockets over here where there might not be enough habitat that's connected for the woodpeckers to actually have one entire home range. So in some of the analyses we did after this, which Rodney's going to talk about, what we did is we added a buffer around every single distinct pocket of habitat, and that buffer was 200 meters. And that number was taken from our telemetry work, where we found that about 200 meters was about the 80th percentile of distances that black-backed woodpeckers would travel between foraging locations. So we figured that 200 meters was about a fair distance of the amount of space through sort of undesirable matrix that the black-backed woodpeckers would be able to travel to get between discontinuous pack areas in order to keep a together home range. So we added this 200-meter buffer around each one of these different polygons, and then we estimated within each interconnected polygon whether or not it contained at least one full home range or not. And we essentially threw out habitat that did not qualify on that. So I think that's it in terms of talking about the mechanistic aspects of how we actually did this modeling. I will pause for about 15 seconds if people want to start writing questions, if they have questions on the actual modeling. Please know that you can actually wait until at the end of the presentation for questions as well. But Rodney's going to start talking again about what we did with this modeling now that we've accomplished it.
Okay. Well, thanks, Morgan. That was great. So yeah, the next series of slides here really illustrate different applications of the model that we've created. And indeed, that is the purpose of the model. I want to remind everyone that what we were setting out to do here was produce a tool that land managers could use for more informed planning of the effects of post-fire management on black-backed woodpeckers. So in these first two images, now we start looking at what are the predicted effects of some of the proposed treatment actions. So in the panel on the left here, what we've done is we've taken the habitat suitability model that Morgan just presented, the habitat suitability map, and we've just colored everything the same for simplicity. So anything that's blue is potential habitat. And then what we've done is we've clipped out all the areas that are going to be affected by the proposed hazard tree removal. And then we redid the calculations Morgan described to see how many pairs of black-backed woodpeckers the resulting landscape would be predicted to support. And the answer was that just doing the hazard tree removal reduces the predicted population from 42 pairs to 37 pairs, or a 12% reduction. Then the other thing we looked at is we took the proposed hazard tree removal plus the proposed salvage and other treatments that would remove snags on the landscape. And this was done as of the preliminary plans that were still in process on January 15th. And so for the rest of these slides, I'm going to keep talking about proposed treatment units, and I want to emphasize that all of this was as of January 15th when we completed this analysis, and that planning may have moved in different directions or changed since then. So the figure on the right clips out those areas affected by hazard tree removal and also clips out all of the polygons proposed for treatments as of January 15th. And you can see what's blue there is the resulting landscape, or at least the way it'll look to black-backed woodpeckers, quite a bit reduced. And the retained habitat we predict would support 16 pairs of black-backed woodpeckers, which would be a 62% reduction from the 42 pairs we would expect if there were no post-fire treatments whatsoever. So here's a slightly different application of the model that we produced. In this case, what we've done is we're just looking at the proposed treatment units, again as of January 15th, and we've ranked them ordinally relative to one another according to how valuable we predict they are to black-backed woodpeckers. And that rank integrates both the habitat suitability values across the polygon as well as the size of the polygon. And so what you see here is that the warmer colored polygons are predicted to have the higher value to black-backed woodpeckers if they went untreated, and the colder polygons would have lower value to black-backed woodpeckers, again, if they were untreated. So this particular use of the tool lets you zero in and say, okay, if we were going to revise the proposed plans and we wanted to select some more habitat to retain, which are the treatment units that would be most valuable to black-backed woodpeckers? And this kind of leads you to those pretty rapidly. So then here's a slightly different use, again, of the same model. This is the habitat suitability model that Morgan already presented, but what we've done now is we've colored it by quantiles of habitat suitability. So again, the warmest colors are the the most suitable habitat and the places where we predict the highest density of black-backed woodpeckers, and the cooler colors are the lower predicted density of black-backed woodpeckers. And now we're looking at all the potential habitat, not just the treatment polygons. And so again, this just lets you zero in on the areas of potentially high habitat suitability, those warmer colors. One of the interesting things that came out of this particular exercise is that area underneath the red oval. That was the largest contiguous area of retained habitat that was planned for in the, as of January 15th in that particular set of proposals. That area had kind of been set aside as, well, other purposes as well, presumably, but as retained black-backed woodpecker habitat. And when we looked at it with this model, what we see, we would also classify it as black-backed woodpecker habitat, but it's nowhere near the best black-backed woodpecker habitat. And indeed, if you were going to kind of go shopping across the landscape for good places to retain black-backed woodpecker habitat, that area only falls in about the 50th percentile of habitat quality across the footprint of the fire. So it's not the best area. It doesn't necessarily mean it shouldn't be retained, but it's worth noting that, again, if you wanted to select places based on their value for black-backed woodpeckers, that might not be the best place to focus. So then we did an exercise. We started wondering, okay, so can we construct this relationship of how much habitat would you need to conserve to retain how many pairs of black-backed woodpeckers? And so that's what we're looking at here. What we've done is we've imagined a scenario where you retained habitat for black-backed woodpeckers only according to habitat suitability for black-backed woodpeckers. That's how you would select your stands. And we realized that in the real world there are a number of competing management objectives that would make it not play out this way. But this was just one exercise to look at one scenario of habitat retention. So if you started your habitat retention essentially from the top of the quantile map, conserving the best habitat first and working your way down through the quantiles, this lets you know how much habitat you'd have to retain to conserve the predicted number of pairs of black-backed woodpeckers. And the y-axis only goes up to 37 pairs because that's how many we predicted would occupy the landscape after hazard tree removal. And then just kind of as a side note here, the dotted line represents the amount of habitat, again, just if you selected habitat based on the quantile ranking, how much habitat would you need to retain to conserve 75% of that original 42 pairs of black-backed woodpeckers? And I'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about that 75% threshold. Okay, so now this kind of visualizes a few different scenarios and summarizes some of what we've already gone over. The map on the far left indicates what the landscape looks like just after the hazard tree removal will be completed. And that landscape, we predict, supports 88% of the predicted pairs of black-backed woodpeckers. Then the image in the middle is based on the graph that I just showed you, that dotted line. If you wanted to retain 75% of the predicted black-backed woodpecker pairs, and you prioritized stands for retention the way I described, this is what the landscape would look like, the retained landscape. And then the image on the far right is based on those preliminary treatment units that were proposed as of January 15th. And that particular modification of the landscape, we predict, would retain or conserve 38% of the predicted black-backed woodpecker pairs across that landscape. So we have a lot of confidence in this model, but it is still a model. And so one of our objectives for 2014 is to get out onto the rimfire landscape before a lot of this harvesting is completed and count woodpeckers, conduct surveys to test our predictions about occupancy and density, and hopefully validate or at least refine the model as needed based on what we find on the ground in 2014 and how that corresponds to our predictions. Now, our work group felt that we didn't want to just provide this tool for evaluating the effects of different management scenarios on the black-backed woodpecker population, we also wanted to make some specific recommendations for how much habitat to retain. And what we settled on was that it didn't make sense for us as an external group to pick and choose individual stands for retention, because we knew there were many other competing land management objectives that we weren't necessarily party to or privy to. And so what we came up with instead was a recommendation that enough habitat be retained to support at least 75% of the 42 black-backed woodpecker pairs that we would predict would occupy the area if no stands were treated. And kind of what we like about this way we structured our model, the elegance of the model, is that the habitat suitability map allows land managers to test whether different management scenarios could meet this or other management goals that they might formulate. So there's not just one path to getting to that 75% pair retention. There's many paths, and land managers can essentially experiment with the data layer and see what the implications of different patterns or different scenarios of habitat retention are on the black-backed woodpecker population for the rimfire. The other thing I want to stress, particularly for the Forest Service personnel from a variety of forests that are on the line, is that our model, although we developed this for use on the rimfire, there's actually nothing about it that is particular to the rimfire, and it's equally applicable to not only the other fires that burned across the 10 forest area in 2013, but to future fires as well. And so we encourage anyone on the line involved with planning efforts for other past or future fires to consider utilizing this approach in developing your management plans. And we are available to provide technical support to facilitate doing that. And then just a couple of other points I want to make that aren't exactly germane to the model but are relevant to the topic. Another recommendation our group wanted to make was about the timing of harvest activities in black-backed woodpecker habitat. And this particular recommendation comes directly out of the Conservation Strategy for Black-backed Woodpecker in California that we published in 2012. And that is, we recommend avoiding harvesting fire-killed forest stands during the nesting season, which is May through July. And that recommendation is based on empirical data that we gathered on nesting black-backed woodpeckers within the area of interest. And that's what the graph there shows you. I think this probably is not, this timing issue is not a great concern for the rimfire in 2014, because my understanding of the timeline is that most of the harvest activities are not likely to be underway until after the breeding season anyway. But it could be a big issue in 2015. My concern is that any unfinished harvest activities that are not completed by winter 2014-2015, there'll be a great temptation to come in during the summer of 2015 and finish those during the black-backed woodpecker breeding season. And of course, felling snags that contain black-backed woodpecker nests during the breeding season will kill the nestlings. And essentially what it creates is that all that habitat that's there during summer 2015 that's being harvested during the breeding season is sink habitat in conservation biology terms. It's all nesting habitat that looks appealing to black-backed woodpeckers, but then all those nests are going to fail. And so we would really urge restraint in 2015 from harvest activities during the breeding season, and would recommend that any harvest activities that are going to occur during that year happen either before or preferably after the breeding season. And then the very last point I want to make is illustrated by these birds right here, which is that while we are quite concerned about black-backed woodpecker conservation, this is about more than just black-backed woodpeckers. This is a pair of western bluebirds that we observed at one of our study sites. It was on the Peterson fire. And these birds were vigorously trying to set up a house in an active black-backed woodpecker nest. So that when we took this picture, there were actually black-backed woodpecker eggs in that nest cavity. And what would happen is whenever the black-backed woodpecker parents weren't paying much attention or would wander away to forage, these western bluebirds would surreptitiously come in and start entering the nest and generally looking very proprietary about the nest, as you see in this picture. And they were really obviously trying to nest here, even though the nest was actively being used by black-backed woodpeckers, who would then see the western bluebirds and come screeching into the area and chase them away, and ultimately the bluebirds gave up. But I think what this vignette illustrated was the really tremendous importance and value of nest cavities created by blackbacks and other woodpeckers in recently burned forest. Those nest cavities get used by many other bird species and many other wildlife species that exist in recently burned forests. I went the wrong way, excuse me. And in fact, here's a nice figure that I lifted from a report by Pat Manley and Gina Tarbill with the Forest Service on a study they did on the Angora fire, where they tracked what other species subsequently used nest cavities that were excavated by blackbacks and other woodpeckers. And as you can see, just in the relatively small sample size of nests that they looked at on the Angora fire, they found, using those eventually abandoned black-backed woodpecker cavities, they found northern flying squirrels, northern flickers, house wrens, American kestrel, chipmunks, mountain chickadee, and western bluebirds. So there's really a whole community of species that utilize this resource. And so when we conserve habitat for black-backed woodpeckers, we're also conserving habitat for many other bird species and many other wildlife and plant species that also flourish in recently burned forest. And ultimately, in my opinion, it's even bigger than that. It's not just about the needs of any individual species or even any individual set of species, but rather the issue here is the importance of maintaining the full complement of ecological diversity across the greater Sierra Nevada ecosystem. In my opinion, at least, recently burned forest, including high-severity stands, are a natural part of the ecosystem diversity across the Sierra Nevada. And I think that maintaining its presence on the landscape should be an integral component of post-fire forest management within the region. And even stepping back a little bit, from the whole regional perspective, I believe that maintaining patches of even high-severity post-fire landscape or post-fire forest on the landscape should be viewed as feeding into the larger goal of restoring and sustaining the greater Sierra Nevada ecosystem. And I think we'll stop there and take questions.
Great. Thanks, Rodney and Morgan, for a very informative and clear presentation. So I am interested in seeing any questions. It looks like there are people are typing. There's one that's been sent just to the presenters, so let me bring that one out here. So we had a question from Sarah Sawyer, and she wanted to know, when analyzing proposed management, proposed salvage units were clipped out as no longer suitable habitat to calculate the new number of pair areas that could be supported. So could models also be used to propose modified salvage activities so that managed areas that include harvest are not necessarily considered to be no longer habitat, but instead may just reduce the density of pairs supported?
Well, I'll jump in with that first and then let Morgan have whatever he'd like. I think it's a good question, and I think the answer is yes. It requires a somewhat more complicated approach. But yeah, we assume the worst case scenario for the individual treatment polygons, that they would no longer be black-backed woodpecker habitat at all. And it's depending on the nature of the treatments being applied, that might not be 100% true. And if one could predict the subsequent snag basal area that will be retained on the landscape, one could incorporate that into the model. Do you want to add anything, Morgan?
No, I mean, I think specifically once we get both either from our model of snag basal area on the landscape, or if we had actual numbers for snag basal area on the landscape, you could then modify those based on reducing snag basal area from essentially the immediate post-fire level down to some managed level, and then essentially recalculate it. So yeah, it's certainly flexible to that type of scenario building.
Okay, then we had another question from Trish Johnson. What was the influence of pre-fire tree and stand size class on suitability?
I'll take that, Rodney. So within our two different modeling frameworks, for the occupancy model, it was in the model. It's kind of a marginal variable. The occupancy model is most strongly affected by elevation and then burn severity. In terms of its impact on determining snag basal area, though, I would say that pre-fire canopy cover was the variable that's quite strong. The stand size class itself seems to be relatively marginal just because it's an ordinal variable, and itself is not super informative. At least we haven't found it to be super informative for this modeling.
Okay, the next question was from Peter Dreckmeyer. He'd like to know, do we know the capacity of local mills to process lumber? And if so, could this number be met while preserving 75% of the black-backed woodpecker habitat?
Well, I imagine somebody has the answer to that question. I don't. It's possible that somebody on this webinar can answer that question. I don't know if we have a way for people to do that, but maybe somebody might chime in if they are knowledgeable about mill capacity. I'm not able to answer that.
Okay, so if you are on the webinar and you have some idea, you can go ahead and type that in the chat box. That would be helpful to us. Okay, so the next question is from Carrie. The IUCN rating is least concern other than MIS. Does this species have other listings? MIS being management indicator species?
So the populations of black-backed woodpeckers that occupy California and Oregon, as well as the Black Hills region, are currently candidate species for endangered status that are under evaluation by the Fish and Wildlife Service. That would be the primary other status that I would be able to think of.
Okay. Well, it looks like we're getting a few more questions, so please go ahead and do that. In the meantime, I had a question for you, and I was wondering about your baseline for modeling. Since most fire scientists agree that the percentage of high-severity fire is higher than it would have been under a natural fire regime, is it possible to model the number of pairs under a high-severity fire in that area versus what a more natural fire severity regime would have produced?
Possibly. I mean, so when we're looking at fire severity in terms of its effect on sort of this heterogeneous landscape, each fire has aspects of it that are high severity, that are medium severity, and that are low severity. So when you're talking about classifying a fire as medium severity versus high severity, to me, I would have to have some sort of specification of what would that mean in terms of the frequency distribution of individual blocks of landscape and where those blocks of landscapes intersect with the actual forest conditions beginning with. So if you just asked me straight out, can you model this? What would happen? What would it look like if it was a high severity burn? That to me is not necessarily enough information. But there would be ways to try and actually model specifically saying, if we increased fire severity in general across the board by 10% in terms of its effect on change in canopy cover, you can make those types of scenarios. Rodney, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't.
Thank you. That's helpful. So it looks like there's more attendees typing. And while we're waiting for their questions, I'll go ahead and bring up our conclusion screen. And at the conclusion here, you'll still see your questions in your chat box, but also there are some web links there. We put in the web link for the Sierra Nevada Bird Observatory. There's a web link for the Fire Science Consortium email list sign up, and then there's one for an evaluation survey of this webinar, which we would be very glad if you would fill out. So to get to those, what you need to do is highlight them and click the Browse To button, and your browser will be open to those pages. So it looks like we have another question from Laurie Perot. What is the basis for the 75% retention recommendation?
Yeah, that's a good question. We struggled with this a lot, quite honestly. And really what it represents is a precautionary principle that we know this is a species with a small population size in California, and our feeling was that that was a minimum threshold for how one ought to manage habitat of a species that's been identified as a species of management concern. There's a lot more work that could be done to essentially model population dynamics and metapopulation dynamics for black-backed woodpeckers in California, and we're just not that far along yet in order to be able to pop a threshold like this out of a quantitative model. But that's essentially what it represents, is a realization that other management concerns are going to mean that some of the habitat needs to be sacrificed for other purposes, but an attempt to still essentially retain the majority of the habitat for the species.
Okay, great. And it looks like I had skipped over one, and that was a follow-up question from Carrie. With the onset of huge wildfires, especially in California, one would assume the population would grow with more habitat?
I would agree with that statement to the extent that habitat is retained. We have to remember that black-backed woodpecker habitat requires both, black-backed woodpecker populations in burned forests require both fires to burn the forest and for those burned areas to be retained on the landscape. And so that second half of it is what we're addressing right here.
Okay, well, great. It looks like we've gotten most of the questions answered. Looks like Craig is thinking of a question, but maybe hasn't finished it. He says there's a lot of potential from hazard trees. He may be answering the question about the mill. There's a lot of wood potential from hazard trees on level 1 and level 2 roads, about 200 million board feet. The haul distance is variable. In other words, the mill capacity is Sonora, Lincoln, and Terabella. It comes down to a matter of balancing ecological values and public safety, as he says, and Forest Legacy's position is that adding SPI's volume and hazard trees is a place to start. That black-backed woodpecker and other species concerns increase when public safety needs are met. So that's something of an answer. If anyone else in the webinar had another response, we'd be happy to see it. Any other questions from anyone online? If you do have additional questions after time goes by, we can contact the speakers with your questions and try and get you answers in the email. This webinar has been recorded, so we have a link to the recording, and we'll be able to send that out to everyone who was registered, and that one can be passed on to others who may not have been able to make the webinar. So with that said, I think it's time to bring the webinar to a close and thank our speakers. Thank you so much. It was very clear and informative and well attended. Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I would just say thanks again to everyone for listening in, and again, we're available for providing technical support if anyone out there wants to try to use our model.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Thank you all.
All right, I'm going to disconnect the audio now. Thanks. Bye-bye.